Hagar were sent out into the desert, and Ishmael was about to die, and Hagar cried out, and God opened her eyes, and there was a well in front of her. That was down at Beersheba. Beersheba means 7 wells, and lo and behold, there are still wells to this day that have been used since the time of Abraham. And if you remember, Beersheba, let me pull up the map here. Well, the map is pulled up, but I'm going to point. Beersheba's right here, and that is the lowest, the southernmost border of Israel. And then up here is Dan, and that's the northernmost border of Israel. And so in Scripture, you'll hear a lot about from Dan to Beersheba. And that means from as far north to as far south. In Beersheba, you have Abraham and Lot Ishmael wanders away and goes down to Kadesh Barnea, which is the region down here. You have Jacob, the grandson of Abraham, starts traveling throughout Israel here. Well, what's now Israel. Of course, it wasn't at the time. But he starts trekking northward, and we're going to talk today about this region right here in Shechem. Shechem is, in Jesus' time, what was known as Samaria, and a lot of action happened right here. So we're going to talk about that because there's a lot of really cool stuff. Actually, let me show the next map too. This is kind of blown up. So if I go back, you see Shechem right here where I'm pointing. Down here's Jerusalem. And then the next map is just blown up. So here's Shechem. Today we're going to talk about some things that happened here in Shechem, very noteworthy things. And here is Bethel. And of course in the day of Jacob, a lot of very fascinating stuff happened here. And just outside of Bethel is where Rachel died, giving birth to Benjamin. And her tomb is still here to this day. So we're going to look at some of those things. It's just fascinating stuff. But here in Shechem, that's where God appeared to Abraham. Remember when God appears to Abraham and says, you're going to have a lot of offspring, and look up at the stars, and if you can count the stars, that's going to be your offspring. Also in Shechem, Joseph was buried there. So Joseph, who wound up in Egypt, ends up being buried in, his bones are brought out of Egypt, and he's buried in Shechem. Joshua's last words that he spoke were at Shechem. And Jesus and the Samaritan woman at the well were in Shechem. And I don't remember, I think we talked about it last week, but there's the well that's inside of a church building, Jacob's well. Did you guys visit that, the well that was inside? Okay, so Jacob's well, the well where the Samaritan woman met with Jesus, is still there to this day, and that well was from Jacob's time. That's known as Jacob's well. In fact, it's referred to in John chapter 4 as Jacob's well. So a lot of really cool stuff in Shechem. I'm going to read about this and then show you guys the picture of this well because it's just very fascinating stuff. So in Genesis chapter 33, if you have your Bibles, turn to Genesis 33. And we're going to move to let's start in verse 12. I was going to start in 18, but I'm going to back up a little bit to verse 12 of Genesis 33. Then Esau said, "Let us journey on our way, and I'll go ahead of you." But Jacob said to him, "My Lord knows that the children are frail, and that the nursing flocks and herds are a care to me. If they are driven hard for one day, all the flocks will die. Let my Lord pass on ahead of his servant, and I will lead on slowly at the pace of the livestock, that are ahead of me, and at the pace of the children, until I come to my lord and seer. So Esau said, let me leave with you some of the people who are with me. But he said, what need is there? Let me find favor in the sight of my lord. So Esau returned that day on his way to Seir. But Jacob journeyed to Succoth and built himself a house made of booths for his livestock. There the name of the place is called Succoth, which means booths. And the Israelites to this day, it's one of their feast days, the Feast of Booths. And this is one of the events that they celebrate during the Feast of Booths. Verse 18, and Jacob came safely to the city of Shechem, which is in the land of Canaan, on his way from Padam Aram, and he camped before the city. And from the sons of Hamor, Shechem's father, he bought for 100 pieces of money the piece of land on which he had pitched his tent. There he erected an altar and called it El Elohe Israel. So here you have Shechem mentioned, I think, for the first time in Scripture. And again, this place becomes a really instrumental place because then it's later identified as a place where Abraham has his calling from God. God calls out to him and says that he's going to have his offspring. And, of course, I said about Joshua uttering his last words from Shechem. John chapter 4, we find this well that's in Shechem. John chapter 4. And we're going to start in verse 1. Now, when Jesus learned that the Pharisees had heard that Jesus was making and baptizing more disciples than John, although Jesus himself did not baptize, but only his disciples, he left Judea and departed again for Galilee. And he had to pass through Samaria. So he came to a town of Samaria called Sychar, near the field that Jacob had given to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there, so Jesus, wearied as he was from his journey, was sitting beside the well. It was about the 6th hour. A woman from Samaria came to draw water. Jesus said to her, give me a drink. For his disciples had gone away into the city to buy food. The Samaritan woman said to him, how is it that you, a Jew, ask for a drink from me, a woman of Samaria? For Jews have no dealings with Samaritans. Jesus answered her, if you knew the gift of God, and who it is that is saying it to you, who is saying to you, give me a drink, you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water. The woman said to him, sir, you have nothing to draw water with, and the well is deep. Where do you get that living water? Of course, Jesus ends up talking about himself. He said, he's clearly referring to himself as the living water. He reveals himself as the Messiah. And then later on, she leaves the well, goes into the town, and then verse 29, she says, come see a man who told me all that I ever did. Can this be the Christ? They went out of the town and were coming to him. So this big group of people come to meet Jesus at this well. So here's a picture of that well. What's interesting is the woman references how deep the well is, and this well is 130 feet deep. And they have since built a church building around it. And what's interesting about this, a couple things. One is that the Israelites recognize this absolutely as Jacob's well. They said this is most definitely Jacob's well that's referenced in the New Testament. But it's also just this whole region, they said, is absolutely identifiable as the land where Jacob lived. Jacob built this well. They identify it as such. The Muslims identify this as Jacob's well, and the Christians identify this as Jacob's well. So it's one of the few areas that they don't all fight over. It's just broadly recognized as absolutely Jacob's well, beyond a shadow of a doubt. What's interesting about that is just so many things. One is that Jacob himself dug this well. So when you're there, and people who go on tour here to this drink water out of it. It's still a good well. It's still a live well. So you have a well that Jacob himself built thousands of years ago, and it's still productive. And they're still drawing water out of this well, and they're still drinking water out of the well that Jacob built. To me, that's just incredible. Jesus himself drank water out of this very well. I think that's also incredible. One of the most lengthy and powerful stories in the New Testament that's really significant, where Jesus identifies himself to somebody other than his disciples as the Messiah, happened at this well. And then all these people that the Samaritan woman brought to this well, they all became believers in Jesus. There's so much significance with this one, probably 3 foot by 3 foot section wellhead. Isn't that cool? I know, 130 feet deep. I have no idea how they dug it, how Jacob dug it. I have no idea. It was a lot of work. But, we know today, and we hear the saying that water is life. And in these regions, these wells were life. And today, you go to Haiti, and I still remember the conversation we were having back in March. We were talking to some people. We went up to the Citadel, and we were asking about water, and they said, we really need a well dug in this area. And there's not a well in this region, so they have to travel miles and miles to get fresh water. And it, definitely was the same back then. People came from all over the place, and it was exhausting. If you remember the conversation with the woman at the well, she said, give me this water so I don't have to keep coming back here. It's not like the well was five minutes from her house. They had to travel miles. And this well was deep, which tells you what about this area? It's not much water. This is an area where it is really hard to find water. And what's another thing that's cool too, how did he dig it? How did he know the water was under there? And I think you had asked that question last week. When we were talking about Beersheba, how did they know that there was all this fresh water in the middle of the desert, that there's this aquifer that feeds these underground pools? I have no idea. Yeah, they had water witchers. Yeah, dowsing rods. They actually do. Here's an interesting fact for you. One of our members who moved away years ago showed me how to douse for water using twigs. Pam McKay. And I thought she was messing with me, but she's not. And she was explaining it to me, and she said only certain people really have the ability and the gift to do it. And I've watched documentary because I was positive she was messing with me, and because I just never really researched it and just didn't have any interest, because we take for granted, we turn the spigot on and water comes out, So who did? Oh yeah, it's really cool. Wow. It's it's for real. There are documentaries on YouTube that talk about dowsing for water and like the science behind it and why it works. Yeah. Yeah. Right. And I imagine that ground is probably not the nicest. They're not digging in sand. It's not like down at Beersheba. Beersheba, I think that's a little different story. You're digging down through sand, then it gets hard, and yeah, yeah, and yeah, and right, and down that, I mean, 130 foot deep. That's about as deep as my mom's well. I don't know. Yeah, and if you know anything about digging wells, you have to case them, or else they collapse in on itself. So how did they case it? Um, how did they dig it? Uh, how did they dig that? I mean, they're digging through rock and solid ground. Right. Yeah, I know. Yeah, that's right. Nope. Oops, sorry. Yeah, that's a good point, Mike. Yeah, I mean, I think after 80 feet, after 80 feet, you know, 4,000 years ago or whatever, 3,500 years ago, 4,000 years ago, they're digging and digging and digging, using whatever means that they were doing it. And you're right, Charles, that is not a wide hole. That's narrow. I know. I know. So yeah, like after 80 feet, did you think they're like, all right, do we keep going? We made it this far. Somehow they knew that the water was there, and it was 130 feet deep. It's incredible. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, if you think about it too, I mean, okay, so that's a deep well. Um, to get the bucket all the way down, to get it all the way back up again, I mean, you're talking a lot of time. A lot of people lined up waiting to use this well, and it wasn't just for them, it was for their livestock too, because she's getting water for the livestock. So yeah, I mean, this would have been probably half a day ordeal anyhow. Yeah. I don't remember if it was from this well. Yeah, sure. Yeah. Yeah, I mean it's absolutely mind-blowing, but when you read that story of the Samaritan woman, you're like, no wonder she was like, give me this water. She's desperate for it, and it's interesting that Jesus used that to really convince her, or kind of play into him being the living water, that he's the Messiah. And it's not coincidence that he winds up at this well. He came here intentionally. He was very intentional about who he spoke to. He was intentional about sending his disciples away. You guys go into town and buy food. Get out of here. He's basically kicking them out of there. And he has this conversation with this woman, and you think Jesus went to that much effort to talk to one person, and that's incredible. Mm-hmm. It's what it sounds like. She was there at the 6th hour. What's the 6th hour? Noon. So, yeah, I mean, it sounds like she's the only one there, but we don't know. I mean, we don't know. Seem it would seem bizarre that she's the only one there. Yeah, 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 yeah. But there's so many interesting things about the story too, because John records that Jesus was exhausted. He was wiped out, and so you have all these things coming together. This is such a significant story, and there's so many significant details to this. And John really spends a lot of time and attention on this story, given a lot of details. And I think in the New Testament, we at least myself, I've always read this, and it never even jumped off the page and stuck out that this was Jacob's well. It's right there in the text, and then you read about it and you just gloss over it, and you're like, oh, the well was deep, and you just keep reading, and you don't think about that. Like this well is 130 feet deep. This well was hand dug by Jacob. This well was well known throughout Israel's history, and so much happened. And again, if the rocks could speak, I mean, what in the world have these rocks witnessed at this well? Um, Fascinating stuff. So cool. Um, Any other thoughts on this before we move on to Rachel's tomb? I know. I have so many questions too. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Oh, yeah, yeah. Right, 8 pounds a gallon. Right. Yeah. Well, what's fascinating too is she's not using leather. She's using clay, probably because of poverty. She couldn't afford to use leather, which is much lighter. She's using heavy clay jars, and she leaves them with Jesus, which I think is fascinating. Um, no, but I mean, for her to leave them behind was, I think, was a huge risk, because she had to have known, she knew at this point that he was the Messiah, that he really was, and she trusted him with that. And I think that's another detail that we overlook in the story, because I can guarantee you, in Haiti or Africa, any of these African countries where people are just living in the desert, they're living in dry climates and water is life. You think they're going to leave the only way for them to carry their water back home for themselves, for their livestock, for their family? You think they're going to leave that in the care of somebody, a complete stranger, somebody they just met? Not a chance in the world. It's not going to happen. And I think that's a detail that we just gloss over. We're, like, it doesn't jump off the page at us, because again, we crack the faucet and water comes out. We don't even think about it. She left her jars there with Jesus. How did she know he was Jewish? Um, because he said so. I don't know. Yeah. Well, you know what? I actually, I had done a study on this before, and I don't know how much truth there is to this, but they talk about accents, that the Samaritan people, uh, they're really isolated. um, Jewish people didn't go into Samaria. Like, they would, it it's in Israel, but they would go around it. They wouldn't even go through Samaria. There was like a long route to get around it. If they were going up north, they would go around Samaria, which is the route that Jesus was going. And then he went through Samaria. Uh, I've never really heard people talk about this, but in the text, John indicates that Jesus was wiped out. He's absolutely wiped out. So he's probably taken a shortcut, um, because he's worn out. But accents, I've always heard that. Have you heard that? Yeah, yeah, right. Big belt buckles and cowboy boots and cowboy hats. Yeah, 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 yeah. Right. Yeah. Right. Yeah. 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 It's pretty cool stuff. Sharon? Yeah. 8 hours there, Mac. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, it makes sense too that they're not going to do it in the heat of the day. I mean, yeah, it's noon when she's there. Probably most people are going to go super bright and early before the sun is up. It just makes sense to do that when you're carrying that much weight. In this region, it's hot. It's not a nice climate. Okay. So the average, if you didn't hear that, the average distance today in developing nations for people to walk to a well, it's 3.7 miles. And what'd you say? 8 out of 10 times it's women and children who go to get the water, and which makes sense too. If the guys are, they'd be out working the fields. Most developing nations, you have agricultural um, uh, workforces, and they're out working the fields, and there's a lot of foresting that goes on. People gathering wood in Haiti for charcoal. And I think a lot of developing nations are that way because they just like it's how they cook their food. They make charcoal, and so the men would be doing a lot of the manual labor, that kind of manual labor, while the women and children are getting the water, doing that manual labor. But it's hard work, and the amount of weight. Um, you ever seen the pictures of people with the bars across their shoulders with the big jugs of water, and they can carry, I mean, gallons and gallons and gallons of water. And at 8 pounds a gallon, you're talking so much weight. And to do that for, I mean, imagine doing that. 3.5 miles is that's from here. What that'd be from here to halfway, about halfway to Berlin. Yeah. Still. Yeah. 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 But keep in mind too. I mean, that's just an average. In this region too, this isn't like Beersheba where you have flat desert. This is in the mountains, and if we go back to the map, um, you look what's on one side. You have Mount Gerizim. On the other side, Mount Ebal. You have mountain down here. I mean, this is an incredibly mountainous region. And if you look at pictures today, um, look at pictures that people put online in this region. I mean, there are mountains everywhere. This whole thing is a mountain. So yeah, yeah, yeah. It's just wild stuff. Um, well, we only have few minutes. What? Well, Dave's ears are just tuned to hear puns. He's a very punny guy. You're so punny. Um, next next week we'll talk about Rachel's tomb, but I think we can start by reading the scriptures. So we'll kind of preface it. There are several scriptures. Let me ring that first bell. There are several scriptures that we're going to read about Rachel's well, or sorry, Rachel's tomb. Um, I have wells on my mind. All we've been talking about is wells. Yeah. Um, okay, Rachel. So you remember the whole story with Jacob, um, Jacob and Esau. We'll start there. Jacob and Esau. Just the whole birth story. So you have the, grabbing of the heel, and then you have the reverse blessing because of the stealing of the birthright. Jacob stole the birthright, or tricked Esau into selling his birthright. Then you have this constant blessing of the wrong birth order throughout Jacob's life. Like, it just surrounds him everywhere. And then you have it with a marriage as well. Ironically, or we should say coincidentally, when Jacob falls in love with the younger daughter, Rachel, what does Laban do? Does exactly what Jacob did, right? He swaps. He deceives him and puts a veil over the daughter who he thinks is Rachel, marries her. They have sex together, and then realize, oh, whoops, you're not Rachel. So then Laban makes him work for so many years, and just on and on and on. And this is, you see this all throughout Jacob's life, even at his death. And it's really fascinating. So Rachel, the woman who he first fell in love with, it makes sense why he mourns her death so badly. The Jewish people, by the way, call Rachel, or Rachel, they call her Mama Rachel, the mother of our mother, or mother of the Israelites. They still go there. The Jewish people go to her tomb still to this day, and they visit Rachel's tomb very often. So the story is really powerful and has a lot of significance in Jewish history. And we're going to look at Genesis 35, and I'll just read this passage today. Then next week we'll read the other passages. Genesis 35, starting in verse 1. God said to Jacob, "Arise and go up to Bethel and dwell there." Well, what do we know about Bethel? Well, that's where we just were. We were right in that area. Shechem, Bethel is just south of Shechem. Make an altar there to God who appeared to you when you fled from your brother Esau. So Jacob said to his household and all who were with him, "Put away the foreign gods that are among you, and purify yourselves, and change your garments. Then let us arise and go up to Bethel, so that I may make there an altar to God, who answers me in the day of my distress, and has been with me wherever I have gone." So they gave to Jacob all the foreign gods that they had, and the rings that were in their ears. Jacob hid them underneath the terebinth tree that was near Shechem. Well, Shechem is literally where we just were on the map, and here where this well is. As they journeyed, a terror from God fell upon the cities that were around them, so that they did not pursue the sons of Jacob. And Jacob came to Luz, that is Bethel, which is in the land of Canaan, he and all the people who were with him, and there he built an altar and called the place El Bethel, because there God had revealed himself when he fled from his brother. And Deborah, Rebekah's nurse, died, and she was buried under an oak below Bethel. So he called his name Elon Bakuth. God appeared to Jacob again when he came from Paddan Aram and blessed him. And God said to him, "Your name is Jacob. No longer shall your name be called Jacob, but Israel shall be your name." So he called his name Israel. And God said to him, "I am God Almighty. Be fruitful and multiply. A nation and a company of nations shall come from you, and kings shall come from your own body." Well, who else heard this in this spot? His grandfather Abraham. He's in the same spot where God said to Abraham, "I'm going to bless you, and there's going to be this great nation, and look up at the stars and try to count them. That's going to be your offspring." God told Abraham the same thing that he told Jacob in the same place. That's not insignificant. Verse 12, the land that I gave to Abraham and Isaac, I will give to you, and I will give the land to your offspring after you. Then God went up from him in the place where he had spoken with him, and Jacob set up a pillar in the place where he had spoken with him, a pillar of stone. Now here's what's significant. He poured out a drink offering on it and poured oil on it. So Jacob called the name of the place where God had spoken with him Bethel. Well, Bethel is a short distance from Shechem. The question is, and we know there's not water around this region, where did he get the water from that he poured over this altar that he built? Now it's interesting. Jacob's well isn't mentioned in the Old Testament. It's mentioned for the first time in John chapter 4. But it makes sense to me that Jacob had dug the well. He goes up into this region. He digs the well. He's up in the region of Shechem, or what would become Shechem. He finds water, digs 130 feet down after saying, my goodness, at what point am I going to strike water? He probably knew he was going to strike water. And when he finds water, what does he do? This is not insignificant that he pours water on the altar, which I don't think is a typical thing, unless I'm wrong. Is pouring water on an altar a typical thing? I don't even know. I don't know the history of that. Typically, right, you pour blood on altars and you're not pouring water on it. So why water? Why is that such a big deal? Why is that Jacob's offering to God? It's a huge deal. Isn't that fascinating? All right, we're out of time. We're going to stop there, and then next week we'll talk about Rachel, which is also in this same exact region. Thank you all.